I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 146 of EO Radio Show. After a hiatus in December, January, and February, we're back on track with the EO Radio Show, so keep watching for new episodes. We're starting 2026 the way I always start election years, a reminder to leadership of charities and private foundations to refresh their understanding of election year issues for those organizations that want to remain exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. This year, we do have a bit of an update that I want to call out today relating to a court case in Texas and proposed federal legislation that could change the scope of the prohibition on candidate intervention by certain kinds of charities. In the next few weeks, we refresh episodes 7 and 8 of the EO Radio Show, which address legislative lobbying by public charities and private foundations, also likely to be very hot topics in 2026. Be sure to check out the show notes for resources from the IRS on these topics as well, and check out the Farella, Braun & Martel YouTube channel for the complete EO Radio Show playlist. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. So as we think about election year issues for charities and foundations, we have to start with the key defining language in the Internal Revenue Code. That's in Section 501c3. Here's the specific language from the statute. No substantial part of the activities of a charity or foundation may consist of carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, except as otherwise provided in subsection H, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. The latter part of this language that refers to campaign intervention is often referred to as the Johnson Amendment, based on when it was first added to the Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. This language referring to campaign intervention has not been changed by the pending Texas court case that we'll talk about in a moment. And as of the date of this episode, some proposed federal legislation has not yet changed the law either. I'll talk about a little bit about this federal legislation, but keep in mind that none of the rules have changed. Until the law changes, organizations that are described in 501c3, colloquially referred to them as public charities and private foundations, should remain vigilant and aware of the well-developed current law on campaign intervention. So a brief summary of the Texas case may be helpful as you try to put that into context. The Texas case, with the title National Religious Broadcasters et al. Versus IRS, is pending in the Eastern District of Texas. The plaintiffs bringing the case against the IRS propose a narrow interpretation of the law under which bona fide internal communications by a house of worship to its congregation during religious services about electoral politics should be viewed through the lens of religious faith and would not constitute participation or intervention in a political campaign. The parties in that case are emphasizing that internal faith context communications do not participate in or intervene in a campaign under the ordinary meaning of those terms. Even before this litigation, IRS enforcement against houses of worship for statements made during services have been rare, and the proposed judgment in the Texas case would, if entered by the court, formalize only a limited context-specific enforcement position, not a blanket exemption for churches or any other 501c3s from the campaign intervention prohibition. This case's legal effect would initially be confined to the named plaintiffs, and broader campaign activities such as public endorsements at outside of services, campaign contributions, or public advertising remain restricted. In addition to the Texas case, the other two current developments that we're watching that affect candidate campaign intervention include companion Free Speech Fairness Act bills were introduced in both chambers, that is, in the House of Representatives and the Senate in 2025. The House bill was referred to the House Committee on Ways and Means, and the Senate bill was referred to the Senate Committee on Finance. These bills are still in committee, and so they have a long road ahead of them before enactment. They would modify, if enacted, the campaign intervention restriction for 501c3 organizations by permitting certain speech in the ordinary course with de minimis incremental expenses, reviving the long-standing policy debate over the narrowing of the Johnson Amendment. As of today, both measures have the status of introduced, and the summaries can be found on congress.gov. It's important to note that these bills have not been enacted, and so the current law remains in effect as it's been interpreted for many years. So before diving into what 501c3, that is a public charity and a private foundation, can't do in the area of candidate campaign intervention, let's talk about the things that a 501c3 can do in the policy arena. Many policy-oriented activities are allowed and can be funded with charity dollars. A public charity may do all of the following. It may conduct public education and training about participation in campaigns. It can educate candidates. It can canvass or poll the public on issues and many similar activities. A public charity can also prepare candidate questionnaires, publish candidate campaign qualifications, sponsor candidate debates, and even conduct voter registration drives, but with some restrictions that have been developed in the law and regulations in these areas, and I'll come back to those in a minute. But let's talk a little bit about the strictly prohibited campaign activities. Public charities and private foundations are not permitted to use charity resources. That includes not only cash spending, but also staff time and charity resources and property. It can't use those things to do any of the following: endorse a candidate for public office, urge the public to vote for or against any specific candidate, contribute money to an election campaign, form or support a political action committee, that is a PAC, provide mailing lists to candidates, score or grade candidates based on the charity or foundation's criteria. The charity or foundation also can't provide campaign workers to candidate campaigns. A charity or foundation can't support political party platforms by any means. Charities and foundations are also prohibited from linking to candidate or PAC websites. So that last point is an important one to think about. Often, a charity or foundation website links to other organizations. And if that linked website page has a reference to a candidate or PAC support, that can be a problem. There's generally what we call the one-click rule. If the link from the charity or foundation website to another organization's site is clean, and that is, it doesn't have candidate activity on that linked page, that's fine. And then, if that other charity links to another page where there is support or impermissible activity, we don't worry about that from our perspective. So pay attention to the one-link rule. And it might behoove the organization, that is the charity or private foundation, to check links to other websites throughout the course of the election year to make sure that no prohibited campaign activity has slipped onto a linked page. So let's focus a little bit on one of the allowable activities that I mentioned a few minutes ago, those things that are allowed with restrictions. The one that I want to start with is candidate scoring. If a charity or a foundation wants to publish materials that score particular candidates for public office, that can be an educational activity and it can be permitted, but only in a narrow set of circumstances. The scorecard needs to cover a wide range of topics on many issues, and there can't be any implication of the organization's views, that is, the charity or foundation's perspective on the issue being discussed or being scored. The communication would need to be a truly nonpartisan candidate scoring that covers many issues and that doesn't indicate the foundation or charity's views on any of the topics for which the candidates are scored. There are also special rules under a special revenue ruling. I'll give the citation here and also mention it in the show links. That's Revenue Ruling 80-282, which has some special rules for charities or foundations that issues candidate scorecards to their members only in a form that's not used to broaden the membership of the organization, where there's no target or reference to an election, no reference to incumbents, and that scorecard that's distributed to the members has to include an appropriate disclaimer. Again, this is a narrow exception to candidate scoring for certain kinds of organizations and certain communications that they make to their own members. So now let's go over a few hot topics that come up, some questions, or I should say frequently asked questions during election years about activities by charities or foundations that communicate during the election year about issues that could relate to campaign activities. So here's a question that often comes up. What type of communications do I need to worry about as an employee or person involved in a public charity or a private foundation? Basically, all communications, including advocacy, fundraising materials, educational materials, any of those can include prohibited campaign intervention. So watch out for communications that may be intended to be educational or fundraising, But if the communication includes distorted facts or code words, such as the words red or blue, which refer to the political parties, emotional appeals, language that's unsupported by reasoned analysis. Basically, if it's a communication and it could be read to indicate support or opposition to a candidate, it's really important to step back and look at it impartially to see if the IRS or any other watchdog group might view that communication as actually an intended campaign intervention. As an example, in recent years, there was a campaign that used the 4 words, vote for a change, in connection with a communication that referred to candidates for an office. One reading of that would emphasize the words a little differently. Vote for a change might mean, you usually don't vote, so vote this year. This is a get out the vote sort of communication, and there's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, it could be read as vote for a change from the incumbent to the new candidate. So that's the sort of an example where if there are other facts and circumstances that indicate the message is actually trying to influence voters to vote for or against a candidate, that's not allowed. If it's a get out the vote communication, it is allowed. These can be tricky scenarios, and it's really important that a careful organization that doesn't want to be challenged for impermissible candidate activity needs to think through what exactly the messaging means. So here's another question, another frequent question that comes up from my clients during election years. As a person involved in a foundation or a charity, don't I have the personal right to campaign for a candidate? Well, yes, of course you do. Just because you work for a charity or foundation or serve as a volunteer on the board, that doesn't mean that you can't, in your personal capacity, be involved in candidate campaigns. But in your official function as a representative of the charity or foundation, you can't be engaging in campaign activity. So in some circumstances, there are functions where people involved in an event might identify themselves as a board member or executive director or whatever, having a relationship to a particular charity or foundation. A common practice is to include a disclaimer in those event materials, the website or the invitation, whatever the case may be, a disclaimer that says the person's affiliated organizations are shown for identification purposes only. No endorsement by the named organization is implied by the listing on this site. A careful foundation or charity, though, is not going to want the charity's name or the foundation's name listed in connection with any candidate campaign event. Here's another frequently asked question. What charities can I use when participating in a campaign? Well, obviously, you can't use the website or social media accounts of the charity. In the olden days when we actually used letterhead paper, you wouldn't want to use paper mail letterhead or paper mail correspondence or envelopes to distribute candidate campaign resources. Nowadays, servers and computing capacity, including email addresses, those are also charity resources. If the communication is going on a charity email from a charity computer, a charity license to software, none of those can be used in connection with a candidate campaign activity. Staff paid time can't be used either. So if an individual associated with a charity or foundation wants to work on a candidate campaign, that can't be done during work hours. It can be done using vacation time, but not paid work time. Obviously, no charity cash resources or economic resources can be used for campaign activities. So it bears repeating here. There are often slip-ups, particularly with email addresses and social media sites. So a wise organization will implement policies and procedures to ensure that charity and foundation emails are not used for any candidate communications. So let's talk a little bit about candidate questionnaires and voter guides that might be published by a charity or a foundation. If a charity or foundation wants to step into candidate questionnaires and voter guides, the first bit of advice is to get very competent legal support as you design your questionnaire and your voter guide. This is not a do-it-yourself area because what's at risk is your exempt status altogether. So here's a general outline if your charity wants to get involved in candidate questionnaires and voter guides. It's really important that the questionnaire or voter guide is put together in a clear and unbiased structure where the structure and the content is unbiased. The questions to the candidates need to be identical to the questions that are actually published in the compilation in the guide that gets distributed. The entire candidate explanation of their response needs to be included as well. The IRS does not look favorably on publishing yes or no answers in these voter guides. The responses from the candidates should not be edited by the organization and should be included verbatim as given to them by the candidate. All candidates for the particular office under discussion should be included in the voter guide. So it often also comes up, particularly with local candidates, that a charity or foundation might have an event at which a candidate for office is invited. If a candidate is invited to speak as a candidate, that's going to be permissible and not treated as impermissible campaign intervention only if all candidates for the office are given an equal opportunity to attend and there's no indication of support or opposition to that candidate by the charity or foundation that's sponsoring the event. If the event is a forum or a debate, there can't be any bias in the way the forum or debate is presented. Questions should be prepared and presented by an independent, nonpartisan panel. They should cover a broad range of topics. There should be an equal opportunity to all the candidates to express their views. The moderator should not challenge the candidates to agree or disagree with the organization's views, and the moderator should be very carefully coached to not comment for or against any particular candidate or position that's stated. But sometimes candidates are invited to events, and they're invited to speak not as a candidate, but for some other reason. This often happens, particularly with incumbents. It may be entirely appropriate for a candidate to appear and speak at an event. But if the idea is to have a single candidate and not all candidates in an allowable forum or debate, as I just discussed, it needs to be clear that the candidate is invited to speak only for reasons other than their candidacy for the office. The speaker needs to be coached that they can only speak in their non-candidate capacity. Neither the candidate nor any representative of the foundation or charity should even mention the fact that the person is running for an office. And there should be no campaign activity in connection with the event before or during or after the particular event. And the atmosphere of the event needs to be maintained as a nonpartisan atmosphere. So let's talk a little bit about voter registration and get out the vote activities. Again, harping on my theme today, the get out the vote or voter registration activity has to be nonpartisan. The IRS applies a facts and circumstances test when looking at voter registration or get out the vote activity. All the communications about the activity have to be limited to urging voting and registration and describing hours and places for registration and voting. All of the services in the registration and the get out the vote drive have to be made available without regard to the voter's political preference, and the activity has to actually be conducted without favoritism. It's stepping into a very sticky area if any candidates are mentioned in connection with the registration or get out the vote drive. Either no candidate should be mentioned at all, which is clearly the better course for a careful charity or foundation, or all the candidates for a particular office need to be named without favoring any candidate over any other. There are some special rules for foundation-funded voter registration drives, and those are found in Internal Revenue Code Section 4942F. I mention that because if your foundation is interested in voter registration drive, that code section is going to be very important to your diligence. So what 4942F does is it allows private foundation grants to public charities for voter registration drives if they meet several criteria. And if these criteria are met, then the expenditure or the grant by the foundation is not treated as an impermissible, taxable, that is a penalized expenditure. So here are the requirements for a 4942F grant to a public charity. First, the grantee's charity activities in the voter registration can't be confined to one specific election period. And the grantee has to carry out voter registration in 5 or more states. And 3, substantially all of the income for the charity needs to be spent directly for the active conduct of the activities constituting the grantee charity's exempt purposes. And here's another key technical rule. Substantially all of the support for that grantee public charity that's conducting the voter registration drive has to come from the general public, and not more than 25% of its support can be received from any one other exempt organization. Another part of the 4942F test is that not more than half of the support for this grantee public charity can be received from investment income, that is, endowment income typically. So in other words, and in short, your grantee charity that's doing this public registration drive can't be substantially supported by one particular grantor, and it can't be an endowed organization that's living off of an endowment. A final requirement under 4942F is that the grantee charity that's conducting the voter registration drive, the contributions to it can't be subject to any conditions that they're to be used only in a specific state or used only in a specific election period. So the key takeaway for this provision, if you are a private foundation that wants to make a grant for a voter registration drive, is to ask the grantee public charity to provide what's called their 4942F ruling letter from the IRS, because the IRS does issue these specific rulings to these public charities that are carrying on voter registration drives. And that says that, yes, we, the IRS, agree that your voter registration drive qualifies. The private foundation donors really need to see this 4942F letter from the IRS addressed to the grantee public charity. For listeners who would like more information about the prohibition on candidate campaign intervention, check out the show notes for a link to webinars on the topic and also to some additional freely accessible links to resources and citations to the Internal Revenue Code provisions I've discussed. And I'll include links to the federal legislation I mentioned and the case in the Eastern District of Texas. The next 2 episodes will refresh earlier episodes on policy advocacy and legislative lobbying by public charities and private foundations. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.